The reckoning at 30,000 feet. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Evelyn Carrington stood by the boarding gate of Flight 672, adjusting the polished brass wings pinned to her uniform. She had done this job for over a decade, serving as lead flight attendant for Paramount Airlines, a company known for its precision and order. Evelyn had built her entire reputation around those very ideals. She was meticulous, exacting, and in full command of any situation, whether it was a passenger dispute or a turbulent flight. But none of her training or experience would prepare her for what was about to unfold. As she made her way through the first-class cabin, checking seat belts and offering polite nods to boarding passengers, she noticed a figure approaching, a man whose quiet presence made her straighten, not out of deference, but suspicion. He was tall, his silver hair trimmed neatly, his posture upright, shoulders back with the kind of poise that spoke of military precision. His eyes were sharp, but carried a calmness that unsettled her. His uniform, though devoid of modern flash, bore the understated authority of a life lived under discipline. He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent with a nod and proceeded toward his seat. Evelyn watched him move to seat 3A in first class, settling in with smooth efficiency. She barely glanced at the boarding pass he handed the agent, but something about the situation didn't sit right. His name, when she'd glanced at the manifest earlier, was listed as Colonel Arthur Maddox. The rank should have clued her in, but her mind whispered doubt. Something in the way he carried himself, calm, deliberate, felt like a challenge, as if he was daring her to question him. Her instincts, honed from years of vigilance, warned her something was off. Passengers continued to board, the noise of rolling carry-ons and soft conversations filling the cabin. Evelyn forced herself to focus on her checklist, but her eyes kept drifting back to Maddox. There was nothing outwardly wrong. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't demanding. And yet, a knot tightened in her stomach. She'd seen people try to bluff their way into first class before. The polished ones were always the most dangerous. They knew how to look the part, and Evelyn Carrington had never been one to ignore her instincts. The seat assignment on his boarding pass matched. His name was on the manifest. And yet, she couldn't let it go. As the last of the passengers boarded and the crew completed their pre-flight routines, Evelyn moved down the aisle with practiced grace. But as she neared seat 3A, she felt her heart beat faster. She stopped by his seat, smoothing her skirt with one hand before speaking. "Good afternoon, sir," she began, her tone polite but cool. "May I see your boarding pass once more?" Maddox's eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. Without hesitation, he handed her the pass again. His expression betrayed neither surprise nor annoyance. Evelyn studied the ticket carefully. His credentials checked out. She couldn't find a single reason to challenge him. But the knot in her stomach didn't ease. "Thank you, Colonel," she said with a tight smile as she handed the ticket back. "Just confirming." He nodded once. Of course. But to Evelyn, his calmness was unnerving. She walked away feeling as though she had lost a battle she hadn't meant to start. And yet, something compelled her to keep digging. She needed to be certain. If there was any chance he was an imposter, it was her duty to act. A half hour into the flight, Evelyn pulled her colleague, Priya Malhotra, aside. "I need you to double-check the first-class manifest," Evelyn said quietly. Priya frowned. "I already did, Ev. Colonel Maddox is listed." "Check it again," Evelyn insisted, her tone sharper than intended. Priya hesitated. "Are you sure? He's been respectful, hasn't caused any trouble." "Just check," Evelyn repeated, jaw tight. As Priya left, Evelyn remained by the galley, her eyes scanning the first-class cabin. Maddox sat serenely, reading a newspaper, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He looked like any distinguished veteran on his way to a formal ceremony or visiting family. But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling. Minutes passed before Priya returned, her expression uneasy. "He's on the manifest," she confirmed. "There's no mistake." Evelyn's mouth was dry. She nodded, but the confirmation only deepened her resolve. She would find out the truth, one way or another. An hour later, as the cabin lights dimmed for passengers to rest, Evelyn found the opportunity she'd been waiting for. Colonel Maddox had stowed his leather briefcase in the overhead bin above his seat. Evelyn approached quietly, her hand steady as she reached for it. Protocol dictated she had no right to search a passenger's private belongings without cause or consent. But she convinced herself that this was an issue of security, and she had the authority to intervene. "Colonel Maddox," she said smoothly as she stood beside him, "I'm going to ask you to step into the aisle." Routine security check. Maddox folded his newspaper calmly, set it aside, and rose from his seat without question. Evelyn pulled down the bag. Her fingers shook slightly as she unzipped it. Inside were neatly folded clothes, a well-worn leather-bound notebook, and a copy of The Art of War. Nothing more. And then his voice, quiet, deep, cut through the tension. "Do you have a warrant for that, Miss Carrington?" The words struck her harder than any outburst would have. She froze, her hand resting on the zipper. "It's just a precaution," she replied stiffly. He nodded slightly, his gaze level. A precaution against what, exactly? There was no accusation in his tone. Only clarity. Only truth. She closed the bag, unable to speak. The other passengers were watching now. Some whispered. Others exchanged knowing glances. The air inside the cabin was heavy with judgment, not on him, but on her. Evelyn forced herself to hand the briefcase back. "Thank you for your cooperation." Maddox inclined his head politely. "Always." As he returned to his seat and resumed his quiet reading, Evelyn stood paralyzed for a moment longer. Then she retreated, her mind swirling with realization. She had nothing. No reason. No evidence. Only the hollow echo of her own misguided certainty. The remainder of the flight passed in silence for Evelyn. She moved through her duties mechanically, her mind distant. The whispers never stopped. She felt every sideways glance. The captain didn't need to say a word when they landed. His glance was cold and sharp enough. Back at headquarters, the summons came swiftly. She stood in the executive conference room 3 days later, wearing her pressed uniform, her hair neatly tied back. Across from her sat Eleanor Maddox, Paramount Airlines Vice President of Operations and the wife of Colonel Arthur Maddox. "You disrespected my husband," Eleanor said, her tone measured, but every word landing like a hammer. "You humiliated a man who has served this country with distinction, who has devoted his life to honor and integrity. And you did it because you decided he didn't belong." Evelyn felt her throat close. She wanted to defend herself, to explain, but the words died in her mouth. What defense could she offer for suspicion without cause? "You assumed," Eleanor continued, "that you were the final authority on who belongs and who doesn't. You acted on bias, not protocol." The suspension was immediate, indefinite, pending a full review. Stripped of her badge, her uniform folded into a box she carried out of the building, Evelyn walked through the airport terminal like a ghost of herself. The weight of humiliation, of regret, settled over her shoulders like a mantle. For years, she had defined herself by her authority. She had believed that control was power, control over passengers, over outcomes, over chaos. But in that moment of misjudgment, she had learned otherwise. Control was fragile, and power wielded without understanding became something darker. She sat on a bench outside the terminal for what felt like hours, watching planes take off and land in the distance. In the echo of their engines, she thought about what Maddox's calm had truly meant. It wasn't defiance. It was composure born of knowing who he was, and that he had nothing to prove. Evelyn had spent her life proving herself. But perhaps real strength was not in proving, but in listening, in humility, in admitting when you were wrong. She could walk away from this, start over somewhere else. But for the first time, she didn't want to walk away. She wanted to face it. She wanted to learn. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn attended sensitivity training. Voluntarily, she requested meetings with passenger advocates, listened to their stories. She read books on implicit bias, on the history of veterans returning home unrecognized. She reached out to Colonel Maddox through Eleanor. A handwritten letter, no excuses, just an apology. Months later, when she was called back for a review, it wasn't about reinstating her badge. It was about rebuilding trust. She would start as a trainee again, under supervision. And she accepted it, because real leadership wasn't about authority. It was about empathy, about recognizing the weight of your choices before they became regrets. On her first flight back in uniform, Evelyn moved through the aisles with a different grace, not from control, but from understanding. She smiled genuinely at passengers. She asked questions she had never thought to ask before. And when a quiet man in a military cap boarded and settled into his seat, she didn't question his place. She welcomed him home.